Hello, I'm Jasma, and to end off mooncake season for 2022, I'm making traditional chestnut mooncakes. To begin, let's make the chestnut filling. This is super simple to put together and there are only 4 ingredients. Roasted chestnuts, I bought this pre-roasted from TNT. You can also either steam or roast your chestnuts yourself, just measure it after it is cooked. The pitted dates is what's adding the sweetness to this recipe, and since it's really sticky, it kind of helps bind the chestnut together as well. Flavourless oil. Traditional mooncakes do contain a little bit more oil compared to snowskin mooncakes because it relies on this to give it that soft texture and prevent it from drying out. And finally, a little salt to taste. Add all of these ingredients into either a food processor or blender and just blend until smooth. Portion into 25 grams each, and then place the filling into the freezer for around 15 to 30 minutes to firm up, but if you're making this far in advance of assembly, keep it in the fridge. Now to make the crust for these mooncakes, I'm using pastry flour for this dough. Now as a quick crash course to flours you can use in baking, pastry flour has a lower protein content or gluten in the flour compared to all-purpose flour, which is what I use for pretty much everything. Pastry flour has about 8 to 10% gluten, while all-purpose flour has about 10 to 12% gluten. And the reason why I'm using pastry flour in this recipe is because the less protein you have in your flour, the less gluten strands it creates, which means less elasticity in your dough, and that ultimately creates a finer crumb and more of that melt in your mouth texture that you want for these mooncakes. Now if you don't have pastry flour, you can substitute it with cake flour, which has an even lower protein content, about 7.5 to 9%, and that'll give you pretty much the same result. For sweetness, we're using maple syrup. Traditional mooncakes typically contain golden syrup to give it that really deep color, but I find that maple syrup is just more accessible and I actually quite like the flavor that it gives the crust. To make the dough, just knead together all of the ingredients, which includes the pastry flour, baking soda, salt, and nutmeg. Give that a quick stir, and then for the wet ingredients, we have the maple syrup and flavourless oil. Then mix until there are no more dry bits. Then cover with plastic wrap and let it sit at room temperature to relax for about 15 minutes or until the filling is ready for us to assemble. If you'd like to make these mooncakes yourself, be sure to grab the recipe from my blog, jasmafusioncuisine.com, where the recipe is fully written out and it also has photo references for each step. Then once you're ready to assemble, portion out the dough to 25 grams each, flatten it between your palms until it's around twice the size of the filling. Then just place the filling onto the dough and seal everything up. Make sure that you push out all of the air between the two because any possible bubbles may lead to cracking during baking. Pinch together the seams and roll it between your palms until it is completely smooth. Then briefly roll this into a cylinder so that the mooncake can fit inside the mooncake mold. Then I like to stamp this directly on top of the baking tray lined with parchment paper so that I don't have to move the mooncake around and possibly dent its shape. Once all of your mooncakes are assembled and stamped, spray it lightly with some water to prevent cracking during baking, and then we're going to send this off into our preheated oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 minutes. During this time, we want to make the egg wash by separating an egg. We're only using the egg yolk mixed with a tiny bit of water. Then when the mooncakes are done baking its first round, take it out of the oven and brush a very light layer of this egg wash on top. Make sure you don't brush too much or you might end up losing the pattern of the mold. Then place this back into the oven to bake for 8 to 9 minutes or until golden brown. Once the mooncakes are done baking, you can eat them straight away, but they are going to have a bit of a tough exterior because there's very little moisture in the crust itself. So what I recommend doing is sealing the mooncakes up in an airtight container and letting it sit overnight or even up to 3 days at room temperature for it to soften up. Now during this time, what's happening is the oil within the filling is going to be absorbed by the crust and allow it to become a really soft, melty texture. This process is called 回油 in Chinese, and the literal translation is for the oil to come back. And in terms of storage, after the 3 days at room temperature, keep it in the fridge, and these can stay good for about a week. Thank you for all the love on the mooncake videos, and see you soon.